The supervisors that sit around the table at the Basel Committee to discuss these topics and matters aren't necessarily those same people who are responsible for implementing those rules.
Oh, of course.
And in that respect, we do see elements of fragmentation and weakening in jurisdictions in the US and in Europe. I think it's fair to add that elements of how Basel is implemented in Europe is not to the same scratch as the international standards. And so we see how perhaps in US you might be seeing less of that gold plating now versus the international norms. Whereas in Europe, I think traditionally, because Basel applied to all 5,500 banks or so, rather than just 16 or banks in the US or 12 in Japan, the rules have had to be amended significantly. And I think, ultimately, how Basel III final endgame or Basel IV, whichever you like to call it, will be implemented will be very, very important, and that will be key. And to your point you made earlier, the planning horizon of these changes are so far out that, in a sense, you could be forgiven to asking, so what's the point of these? Will it really filter down and make much of a difference, make much of an impact? And whilst the role of stress testing for sure is as a welcome addition to looking at the resilience of banks, to some extent there's still a lack of international cooperation with regards to coordinating these stress tests, the implication of these stress tests, and in particular look at the funding lines between central banks in the event of a crisis, because as you mentioned, in life banks are international, in death they're national. Well, ultimately we need to look at those kind of systemic connections and how the central banks will talk to each other when providing that crucial dollar funding line. And ultimately that's a point of stress, and we saw that, as I mentioned, with Banco Popular in terms of how the emergency liquidity assistance was provided. And in Europe, that's pre-fragmented. It's down to the national central banks. It's not down to the ECB, although Mario Draghi did put up his hands in February and say we probably need to look at that. Post-resolution funding, again, it's very much kind of fragmented on a national basis, and we're looking at, in Europe, changes to try to centralise that. So I think there's still some significant fault lines, essentially, that need to be tackled. And conduct, again, anti-money laundering directive, the European Commission is chasing over half of its members for improper implementation of those rules, which still indicate there is work to be done.